Hey everyone, good morning and good afternoon. We're going to give people a little bit of time to file in here, so we'll probably get started in about 2 or 3 minutes while people file in. For those of you already on, thanks for signing in. Going to give a few more minutes here, probably get started around 12:01 Eastern. All right, we'll get this show on the road. I'm sure more people start to file in. So just quickly before we start, you should see somewhere on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a chat. There's also going to be a couple polls throughout the webinar that will tell you when they're in there. So if you're in here and you're able to vote, that's great. And then if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to put them in the chat. Some of the Tallan and UnifyCloud team can answer them on the go, and then we'll also have a Q&A at the end to follow up on any of them. So I'm going to get it started here. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about how people are modernizing their data and really how that's driving their digital transformation. So just a brief overview of the agenda for today. So going to go through some brief introductions of the presenters, and then Tallan and UnifyCloud. And then we're going to dive right into, I'm going to give a high level on digital transformation as it relates to databases. And then Marc is going to share some real life customer use cases. And then Tony is going to be demoing some of the really great UnifyCloud tools and how those kind of help you evaluate where you are today with your databases and how to get them to the cloud. And then we're going to close out with a little bit of where you can get started and next steps, as well as the Q&A at the end. So just quickly for introductions, I'm Ryan Clark. I'm one of our business development managers at Tallan, focusing on Microsoft technologies. Been at the company about 2 years, came up through our cloud practice. So a lot of my background's on Azure and modernization plays at customers. Mark, do you want to go ahead and go next? I think you're on mute right now. Oh, Mark, you're on mute if you're talking.
Hey everybody, Marc Pinotti, CEO and co-founder of UnifyCloud, and someone who doesn't understand the use of the mute and unmute button.
Tony?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tony Clark. I'm a technical program manager here at UnifyCloud. I have a background in infrastructure and data center design, and I'll be showing you our products today.
Great. Mark, if you're able to go back on mute just to limit background noise, should be right at the bottom. Perfect. And then, yeah, just to introduce Tallan and UnifyCloud a little. So we've been partnering really closely together in the past couple years on some of the assessments we've been doing for customers to help them kind of roadmap how they're going to get their apps, their databases, and everything to the cloud. And just some recent accolades. Tallan this year was the Partner of the Year finalist for the Power BI Award. And then UnifyCloud was actually the 2020 Partner of the Year winner for the Solution Assessment Award. So we've been partnering with them a lot more on our solution assessments for cloud modernization, and we're excited to kind of show you the process and the approach and their tools here today. And again, congratulations to Mark and team on the win this year. That's great. So just I'm going to dive in on a high level on digital transformation on the database side. To kick us off here. So, typically when we're looking with a lot of our clients of their path to the cloud, there's really these three core areas that we're always looking at and evaluating. Some customers are lifting and shifting first. So, they're taking what they have on-prem in terms of VMs and actual servers, and they're just shifting it to virtual machines in the cloud. And that's a typical first step approach. But then, when you get past that, you're really starting to look at, okay, what specific workloads or applications, and then even databases do I want to move next, and then also how do I want to maybe modernize my applications and not just use infrastructure services in the cloud, but platform services. So a natural next step we see a lot of people doing, and we did a webinar on this probably about a year ago, is apps and looking at app modernization. But then arguably one of the more difficult things is the databases, and how do I move the databases along with the apps or thereafter. So we're seeing a lot of customers that may move the app first and then keep databases on-prem in the meantime, but eventually you're going to want to move the databases as well. And in some cases, you're going to want to move them together to kind of decrease the latency that may cause. And then when we're looking at the database side of things, there's a lot of different options when you're moving your databases to the cloud. And obviously, at the core of every business is their data, and it's probably your most prized and valued asset. So you want to make sure it's safe, it's secure, and that's usually why it's one of the harder things that we're seeing moving to the cloud. But when you do get your data in the cloud, there's a lot of value that can be driven through a lot of the Azure data services, and brings a lot of good insight back to the business. And then in terms of why people are migrating, so kind of touched on it a little bit at the end there, but when you talk about enabling innovation, it's one thing to get to infrastructure services and just get your databases in the cloud. But then when you start to look at, hey, like what are some of these Azure data services on the PaaS side that I can use, and what are those going to enable me to do? That's where the UnifyCloud tools, as you'll see later on in the demos, will kind of help you evaluate how ready your databases are for those services and the amount of effort needed to kind of get them there. And really, when we talk about enabling innovation, we're talking about things like AI, ML technologies that are going to enable you to be more predictive around your business, and really use that data to drive key business decisions. And we're working with a lot of customers now to sort of implement those technologies and new data architectures in the cloud that are making it a lot easier for them to make business decisions and really drive scale across their data. And then the other thing that we're seeing a lot is really mitigating risk. So when you move your databases to the cloud, there's a lot of really built-in security in Azure. Everything from advanced threat protection to other sort of governance models and stuff you could put up against your databases. And it's really all managed by Microsoft. So again, you really get to focus on the enabling of innovation and using your data to drive decisions instead of having to worry about, is it secure, is it safe, and all of those things. And then the the last thing is really optimizing costs. So I have a nice chart that you'll kind of see at the end of my section here, but when you first move to the cloud, there's definitely an initial investment in getting the databases there. But then as you start to move into the platform services, there's really a lot of cost savings on those Azure data services. And what we're finding is that people that are starting to move to them, it's really like you only pay for what you use, and it's like, the electric company, you only pay for as much electricity as you use. Those platform services and Azure data services get to be a lot more similar. So you may have your peak times where you're going to use more, and then you're at an operating level for the rest of the year. And Tony's going to dive in a lot with the tools that he's going to show of how you can learn to optimize the cost around your databases. And then I want to take a second here to do a quick poll before I start presenting. Gina, if you want to pop that first one into the polls of what databases people are using today. And I'll just give it, a couple seconds here if you guys want to go ahead and vote on, and you could select multiple options, I believe, on this one. So I'll give it a couple seconds. Okay, great. So it looks like we got some results in. Looks like a majority of you are definitely SQL Server users, so that's great. A little bit of Oracle, Postgres. So yeah, I mean that's awesome. And I guess the point we're getting at here is your data journey to Azure. It doesn't really matter what kind of database you're on. There's a path to something in Microsoft Azure. So whether it's SQL Azure or MySQL, or like a Cosmos DB, or simply just moving it to VMs on Azure to start, like that lift and shift approach. There's a lot of different ways you kind of start that evaluation. And Tony will show you a little bit about how the tools at UnifyCloud evaluate SQL Server readiness, and even Oracle, which I know probably is the next closest thing of what most of you are using, and the poll results kind of show that. Excuse me. Go to the next slide. And then we kind of talked about this a little bit already, but just to kind of outline, where you are now and probably where you're heading. And most of you are probably really familiar with this by now. It's been talked about a ton across, the space. But when you're looking at the sort of infrastructure services, there's obviously still a lot you're managing. You're getting caught up in the day-to-day maintenance of those databases, and then the ultimate goal in getting you to the platform services is so you could really just focus on those databases and the data inside them, and how to create value from them. And then the other thing about the Azure data services on the platform side is there's a lot of built-in, like we mentioned before, built-in security around those. So, Azure and Microsoft, they've taken a pretty good stance on security, compliance, and governance around data and applications in their cloud. And they provide a lot of those services back to their customers, so you could just focus on innovation. And then I wanted to mention one thing that a lot of our customers are starting to ask about, and they're starting to look into as like a good path forward for some of their SQL databases. So you may have some that are going out of service, or you may have some that you don't really want to update them again, but you know that you need to get to the cloud. So there's this idea of SQL database managed instance. So with SQL database managed instance, it's kind of the best of both worlds, and you get to leverage your current investment of your on-prem SQL and get it to the cloud. And that chart you kind of see there, obviously with the initial investment up front, you're spending a little, but what we're seeing is within 6 months or less, there's a big payback on that and of the total benefit and the return on your investment for SQL managed instance. And again, Tony will kind of show you how the tools will kind of help you evaluate those options around managed instance versus Azure PaaS options and others. And then with that, I'm gonna hand it over to you, Marc, to talk about a couple use cases. So have at it.
Great, thank you, Ryan. So what we want to do is walk you through a couple of customer scenarios. This was one that is a U.S. Headquartered company, Global 1000 in the financial services industry. It was kind of interesting. They also did a lot in sort of real estate services, and they had an interest in moving their applications on-prem straight into PaaS, platform as a service. The reason they wanted to go directly to PaaS and skip over the IaaS step was that they realized they were going to get better business agility, better cost savings, and going to PaaS would make it easier for them to tie into the IoT services and the Azure Data Factory, the big data analytics capabilities of Azure in a way that just going lift and shift would not have enabled. So they had 65 databases, which was really the key, and of course the associated applications. So in this case, they were looking to assess all of them. And if we were to do it manually, we've done a lot of work with Microsoft Engineering, Microsoft IT, and they tell us that it takes about 3 developer days for a developer to go through 10,000 lines of code, scripts, stored procedures, that sort of thing. That's assuming the developer knows the database and applications and also knows Azure. So you can see it would have taken many years for a single developer to do that. And using the automated tools, we're able to do that in about 2.5 hours. So a huge productivity benefit there. A couple of key points. What we're doing here is scanning the schema, scripts, and stored procedures of the databases. We actually don't touch the database. So typically what we'll do is, the customer can certainly run the tool themselves, get some metadata out of it, review that metadata, and then once they're comfortable, that it gets uploaded to our portal. They can also copy the schema, scripts, and stored procedures to a dev test environment. So we don't need to be anywhere near the data. We understand how sensitive the customer data is. So just to let you know, that's how it works. And similarly, on the application source code, the customer can run the tool, extract out the metadata in an XML file, which they can review and verify that there's no secrets or IP or anything sensitive. And then that can then be uploaded to the portal. So the main thing is you're in control through the whole process. And the advantage of this is you're really going to drive a ton of cost savings and increase your business agility and ability to do innovation. Next case study was a customer in the Asia Pacific region, again, also financial services related, and they wanted to go from their Hong Kong data center to Azure. In their case, they had a large number of Oracle databases. So this was an opportunity for them to dramatically reduce their Oracle licensing costs. And we moved to Oracle to Azure in 2 ways. Some of the databases, for some technical reasons, were moved to SQL Azure, and others were moved to Postgres on Azure. And those are also the business critical applications associated with those databases were also moved. Again, you can see a similar type of productivity benefit in terms of the scripts and store procedures and lines of code, and how we were able to scan that. In this case, instead of 4 or 5, developer years, we were able to do it in under 2 hours. So that's the power and the capability of the tools. So with that, we'll turn it over to Tony for a demo of the tools and their capabilities.
Yeah, let me disable sharing so Tony could hop in here. Tony, the floor is yours, my friend.
All right. I am going to share my screen here.
Great.
And you guys should be seeing that now.
Yes, we can see it.
So I'm going to focus mostly on Cloud Pilot, but I am going to show you some functionality in a second tool called Cloud Recon as well that I think will be helpful as you're analyzing your data estate and looking at options for IaaS and PaaS. So Cloud Pilot, which is the portal you see on screen now, this is an online tool, but it starts with a scan of your database. There's a small tool that you download into your environment, and you point it at your database servers and you select the databases you wish to scan. As Marc already indicated, we're not really scanning the data. We're looking at the schema, stored procedures, SQL statements, and so forth. So it's very secure, and we're certainly not going to take any customer data out of your database and upload it to this portal. We will generate a JSON file with metadata that we then finalize the analysis here in the portal. And what you're looking at is what we call the portfolio view. And you can see here that we have 85 assessments comprised of 62 databases and 69 applications. Across the top here, you see a summary of the assessments on the databases. So for all 62 databases, we're estimating a cost of $37,000 for SQL DTU, $60,000 for SQL vCore, $17,000 for SQL Managed Instance, and $29,000 for IaaS or SQL running on a VM. You can also see we have 13 Oracle assessments as well, and we're showing a cost for migrating Oracle to Postgres of about $2,700 a month. Below this, you also note that we can do application assessment. So if you need to assess your applications for readiness for Azure, we can do that as well. As I scroll down the page, you'll see a sort of a summary of the database assessment recommendations. And you can see for the databases we've assessed here, how many databases have these particular problems. You can look at that detail here by clicking on the assessment summary. And this gives you some detail around the databases, what their readiness is, what the level of effort to make the recommended changes. Here you see the recommendations or warnings, and then a compute cost for DTU, vCore, and somewhere in here is managed instance. All of this data can be exported to Excel if you want to do some more analysis on it. Now, as I scroll down,
Tony, sorry to interrupt. Do you mind just hitting hide on the thing on the bottom there?
Yeah,
it sneaks up on you. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So scrolling down the page, you see one page of my assessments here, and you can see I have several database projects. We're going to look at this one down on the bottom here, which I believe is here. Yes. So here we have 14 databases in what we think of this as a portfolio. This would be a group of databases that are all performing a certain function, or they may represent a certain location of your company or whatever. So for these 14 databases, we've again calculated some baseline cost. As you can see, Azure SQL, about $11,600, SQL on a VM or IaaS, about $1,500, and SQL Managed Instance, about $1,000. Now, one of the reasons why Azure SQL is so seemingly high here is because we've done no consolidation at this point. In other words, we have 14 databases. We assumed 14 instances in Azure SQL. Clearly on SQL on a VM or SQL Managed Instance, we can consolidate those into a single database server. And as you can see, there's a great cost savings there. For the 14 databases, we've summarized migration blockers, behavioral changes, feature parity, and so forth for each of the service types. Okay. And then down below, we've broken that cost out by SQL DTU, SQL vCore, lift and shift costs, and manage instance costs. As we scroll down the page, we now see our list of databases. And you'll see, I know it's probably a little hard to see on your screens, but you'll see these red and green bars on the right. These represent the relative readiness for this database to go to a particular service. So the first column is Azure SQL, the second one is IaaS or SQL on a VM, and the third column is SQL Managed Instance. Now you can see several of the databases on the bottom half of the page are all 100% ready. So these would be obvious candidates to pick up and move to Azure immediately because they can move with no changes whatsoever. You'll notice the top one, however, is not quite as ready, showing 80% readiness for Azure SQL, 75% for IaaS, and 88% for SQL Managed Instance. So if we click on the View button here, we can now dive into the detailed assessment report for this database. You can see this is a Microsoft SQL database. It is SQL Express Edition 64-bit, server version 14.0.2027. Recommendation here, of course, is to go to PaaS, either Azure SQL or SQL Managed Instance. Either of those will give you optimal benefits in the cloud, but it doesn't mean that going to IaaS is a bad idea. It just means that you probably won't see as much benefit out of a lift and shift migration versus a migration to PaaS. In the middle here, we have the recommendation results for each service type. So for Azure SQL, we see 16 recommendations, IaaS 13 recommendations, and SQL Managed Instance 11. And then to the far right, we see a relative cost. Now, this is just compute cost. I will show you the costing dashboard and show you how we can refine that cost. But this is meant to show you relative costing for the different service types, so you can do an easy compare. And as you might expect, standing up a VM is the least expensive, although again, not the best in terms of financial benefit. Below, we see migration effort. So for the number of changes we identified up here on the top, we've calculated the number of hours that we estimate it will take to make those changes. So for Azure SQL, about 57 hours. For SQL on a VM, about 49. And for SQL Managed Instance, about 41. And then on the bottom right, you see once again the relative readiness for each of the service types. So to see the detail behind these recommendations, we go over here to the left and click one of the assessments. So let's look at Azure SQL. This will bring us into the detailed assessment for this service. Okay, a couple things you'll note here. You'll see there are 16 total recommendations impacting 125 objects in the database. We've taken those 16 changes and we've broken them down into small, medium, and large. And based on this, this is how we have calculated the recommendation effort. So you can see the 5 small changes will take about 5 hours. The 9 medium changes will take about 36 hours. And the 2 large changes will take about 16 hours. Now, this is a relative estimate. Obviously, people who are not as familiar with SQL or Azure may take a little longer. People who are experts may take a little less time. As we scroll down the page, we now see the detail behind the changes, and you can see there are multiple categories here, okay? So the 4 categories are behavioral change, migration blocker, information, and feature parity. So a behavioral change is something that is in your database does not work the same way in Azure SQL. In this case, order by specifies an integer ordinal, and this rule checks storage procedures. So you can see there are 90 objects, 90 procedures that are impacted by this statement. So you can see the objects impacted. We have a recommendation as to how to specify the sort column. We estimate this is a small change, but we give you the detail here that you need to make that change. Looking at migration blockers, these are exactly what they sound like. These are changes that are absolute mandatory. This will not work in Azure SQL. In this case, this particular customer is using SQL CLR assemblies, and those are not supported. So you can see we don't support those, or rather Microsoft doesn't support those. And this would be a change that would be needed to be made to this database. And you can see several types of migration blockers here. Cross-database queries using 3 or 4 part names not supported. Again, the objects impacted by that, right? And the recommendation on how to make those changes. Informational changes are things that that we're trying to share information with the user. For example, this customer was either doing database mirroring or failover clustering. Okay, and this functionality is not supported in that way in Azure SQL. Now, database mirroring and failover clustering is typically about high availability, and there are different ways to achieve that high availability in Azure. It's just that using Azure SQL, you won't be clustering instances in Azure SQL. So we're informing you of that here. Here's another one about business continuity and disaster recovery. So again, how you implement those on premise could be different in the cloud. And so we just want you to be aware of that. And then last but not least is feature parity. And this is basically features in whatever version of SQL you're using are not exactly the same with Azure SQL. Sometimes this is a little confusing because people assume that Azure SQL is identical to a SQL server running on premise. However, this is not the case. It is mostly the same, but there are some nuances, and we try to point those out. In this case, cross-database references are not supported. Here's another one. Azure SQL does not support trace flags. So you're using features in the on-premise version of SQL that are not supported, and therefore you would need to remediate that in order to make this database work. We do the same level analysis for the other 2 services as well. In some cases, you'll see the mix of changes are a little bit different. Here we have 1 small, 10 medium, and no large. But at the same time, you will often find some of the very same recommendations regardless of the service type. Here's the order by recommendation. Here's CLR assemblies. This is your breaking change. Here's migration blockers, database snapshot, not supported in SQL managed instance. And then feature parity. This one, I always laugh at this one. It says SQL Server reporting service not supported. Okay, so the way you do this is you activate a reporting service in the cloud. So it's not that you can't get SSRS functionality, but you're going to get it in a slightly different way. And last but not least, of course, SQL running on a VM. Generally speaking, this will be the easiest means of getting your databases into the cloud, but as I've stated before, not necessarily the most beneficial in terms of operational efficiencies or even cost. So you really want to compare the different services and what it is you need in your environment to really determine if IaaS makes sense. But once again, we cover the same types of changes in detail here for IaaS. Okay, so now we talked about costing a little bit. Cloud Pilot in and of itself is really not a costing tool, right? We're just scanning databases, so we don't really know a lot about what infrastructure that database is running on, what level of performance it needs, and so forth. Now, we can import some of that data into Cloud Pilot from external sources like Mover, Azure Migrate, or our own tool, Cloud Recon, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And we can get more accurate sizing. The costing dashboard allows you to incorporate the additional services that you will need when running this database in the cloud. So it's not just the compute costs. So as you can see here, we have costing dashboards for every service type. And if we were to click on one of those, it would bring up a cost calculator. Now, all these calculators are based on Microsoft's calculators. So again, we're not reinventing the wheel here. This is the calculator that Microsoft would show you, and we can go in and edit the parameters here. So you can see our region is Australia. Well, we're going to be in East US too, so we can specify the region. And costs will be calculated based on that. We can have single databases. We can change our purchase model from DTU to vCore, change our tiering, and change our performance level, right? So we have complete control over this so that we can see a more true cost. In addition, we have other services that you may want to include. You may want to put your database behind a load balancer. You may need to implement ExpressRoute if your applications are staying on-premise, but your databases are running in the cloud. You'll be running hybrid, so you may want to incorporate that. And there are many different services that you can see here that we can include, including additional storage, and then calculate a more accurate cost for running this database in the cloud. Okay, so the costing dashboard is a very useful feature for helping you understand what the true cost of running in the cloud is, not just the compute cost. Okay. So, and before I leave Cloud Pilot, I will quickly show you that just like for databases, we can do that same level of analysis on applications. Here you see a portfolio of 10 applications. You see the same level of readiness estimates, and then I'm not going to go into it, but you could go in and see what recommendations are being made for the application, just like we do for the database. Okay, now I'm going to quickly jump to Cloud Recon because I want to show you an aspect of Cloud Recon that is very useful, especially as you're analyzing your data estate and looking at your different IaaS and PaaS options. So Cloud Recon takes inventory and performance data from external tools like Mover, Azure Migrate, Microsoft Map Toolkit, SolarWinds, and many, many other sources. Taking this data, we can now begin to build a cost analysis around hosting your databases in Azure. Here you see the consolidation report. Okay, so for this particular example, there were 205 SQL instances, 974 databases. We show some consolidation here for managed instance, and we show a cost for that. We show both DTU and vCore costing, right? In this example, it looks like DTU cost appear to be the lower of the three. Down below this, we have other database types that we can analyze, and we can look at those for Azure deployment as well. And down on the bottom, you can see we have both DB2 and Oracle. And in this case, this is just a lift and shift analysis of running Oracle on a virtual machine, as IaaS. Okay, so worst case is you do a lift and shift of Oracle to a VM. However, you can see over here on the left, we have deeper analysis around all of these. So I'll take a quick look at SQL Managed Instance. One of the things about SQL Managed Instance that can make it very attractive is the ability to consolidate databases into fewer numbers of instances. Here you can see a very detailed costing analysis around Managed Instance. Here we have a list of all the instances that were considered, along with their utilization information. And then here we show how we size those instances based on the performance and configuration data. And then here we show what is possible after a consolidation. So rather than total number of instances here was, what was it, 88 instances. After consolidation, we can get this down to basically 6 instances. So there is a potential significant savings here. And of course, you can see the instances, and then if you expand them, you can see what databases we have collected and grouped per instance. Now, this is not exactly the way you would do it necessarily, but it is just to show you that based on performance and configuration, we can group instances together and then get the benefit of managed instance from that. Okay. And down below here, I did want to show, last but not least, Oracle, because I understand there's a lot of Oracle deployments out there. And we are actually seeing a lot more customers looking to move Oracle to Azure. And in many cases, they're looking at moving that to Postgres. And here we've done some analysis on, there were 6 Oracle servers with 9 Oracle instances. We determined 5 of them were end of support. And you can see some information here that we've calculated on those costs as well. So that is Cloud Recon, a very useful tool when looking to migrate your databases into the cloud. So Ryan, I'll turn it back over to you unless there are any questions.
Yeah, I think we'll try and hold some questions till the end. So if you're able to unshare, I think I could probably just take it over. Yep. Okay, perfect. So yeah, just we're diving into the tail end here. Just a few more slides I'm going to present. Gina, if you wouldn't mind putting up the last 2 polls in the polling section. We just have a couple questions on what databases you already have in the cloud, and also what your time frame may be on planning to move some of these databases. So Gina's going to post those in there, and feel free to start voting. In the meantime, I'm gonna dive back into the slide deck a little. So Tony did a great job of demoing the products, and then Marc dove into some use cases. So I wanted to dive in a little bit about kind of Tallan's approach and how we've been working with UnifyCloud to kind of enable customers with these sort of assessments. So we call this at Tallan our Candyland slide, and really we can meet the customer or a client anywhere on this Candyland, but I'll kind of walk it through from the beginning. So typically, when we're starting with a customer, it's really important to understand, hey, what are the key business drivers and what are the outcomes you want to accomplish in moving your databases to the cloud, and like why are you considering doing this? What's the time frame? And then once we kind of understand that through a workshop type scenario, we then move into the roadmap, and that's really where UnifyCloud comes into play, and we work really closely with Tony and Marc and the rest of the team to run those tools. And then basically what you saw from what Tony presented is we're able to inventory all your databases, not only bring you back a TCO and economic type analysis on the costing, but also what's the level of effort it's actually going to take to move these databases to the cloud. And then typically from the UnifyCloud tools, our architects at Tallan and consultants were able to make a pretty robust roadmap for a client. And then from there, we go into really this proof of value and foundationalizing in the cloud. So we'll say, hey, let's take that first database or those first 2 databases that we recognized on the roadmap, and let's do a proof of value around that. And what we'll do is we'll set up a landing zone in Azure that has a baseline governance and security and compliance around it for those databases, and then we'll move those to Azure. And whether it's a managed instance or SQL PaaS or just SQL on VMs, we'll test that for you, and we'll make sure that you're comfortable with where you are today and where you're going to be when you ultimately get these databases to the cloud. And there's definitely a culture shift of how some of these things work, and we'll make sure that you understand that. And then typically what we're doing once we get those first couple up there is we're saying, hey, let's go back to that roadmap that we created with UnifyCloud and those tools, and like let's identify the next set of databases. So like what Tony showed was some may be more ready than others. So maybe like some of the things we'll evaluate is, do we want to move the ones that are the most ready? Are there ones that are mission critical that we move first? But then we're always going back to the roadmap of what's the next priority. And then that's kind of when we get caught in this loop of, you know, minimum viable product and then migration. And then no matter what the scope of the roadmap is, we'll go through those iterations until what you wanted moved is moved and you're comfortable there. And then when we shoot out the end, we're ultimately trying to operationalize everything. So we want to make sure that you're able to monitor your databases using Azure native tools, third-party tools, whatever it may be, to make sure that you're evaluating governance ongoing, you're able to monitor, you're able to stay in compliance and keep security up to date. And then that leads me to that blue line, which is really governance and enablement. So we start with that, and that constantly gets evaluated throughout. And then just to dive into how you can, you know, kind of talk to UnifyCloud and Tallan going forward. We have a database accelerator, or a data accelerator we call it, where we do it kind of exactly what I was talking about on that Candyland. And there's basically different T-shirt sizes you see there, where you could start with a smaller amount or a little bit bigger amount of databases, and then we could kind of go through from there. So we'd run the UnifyCloud tools. You'd work with Tallan as a consultant to kind of help you make that roadmap. And then Microsoft's also a big piece of the puzzle, because we're both very integrated Microsoft partners. There's typically some funding that could go along with these sort of engagements to get you guys moving. So kind of the three-legged stool there, and a good way to get started with us that we could circle back on. So with that, I'll kind of open it up to the Q&A. If there's any questions about the tools, potential next steps, feel free to pop those in the questions or chat, and we can get those answered. All right. I'm not seeing anything in there just yet, but we'll definitely be following up. And if there's any you know, questions that you'd rather just email us about, our emails are here. Both me, Tony, and Mark, or all of us. So I just wanted to thank everyone again that was able to attend, and I hope you guys found some value in the walkthrough of the tools, and even the higher level overviews of some of the use cases and the value you get out of this. So everyone have a great day, and we'll be hopefully catching up soon.